Quite a huge claim hit the headlines a couple of days ago, namely that a mound of earth in West Cumbria could contain the grave of the famous or infamous Ivar the Boneless. The archaeologist making the claim believes that Ivar was buried with his ship under a hill referred to in medieval texts as the King's Mound, and said the exciting discovery could mean that there was a Viking necropolis hidden somewhere on the Cumbrian coast. So I think this is quite the opportunity to talk about Ivar, because he is already shrouded in the mists of popular culture, and what we actually know about his life, death, and his burial place. So Ivar the Boneless, known in Old Norse as Ivar hin Beinlausi, often referred to as Ymer in the Irish sources, as Hingvar in the English ones, was a 9th century Viking commander, quite a talented one, who managed to establish a very powerful dynasty spanning Ireland and Britain. Much of the personal details about his life actually stem from later sources, the Icelandic sagas, but we do have contemporary records such as the Annals of Ulster and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which do provide a timeline of his military and political achievements. 13th century Icelandic sagas name him a son of Ragnar Lothbrok. However, contemporary written accounts are far more laconic and offer no conclusive proof of his origins. The same sagas use the nickname Boneless, describing him as being carried on a shield in battle, which has led to some theories that he might have suffered from paralysis, brittle bone disease, or whatever. However, there are some more realistic explanations for his nickname as well. For example, a scribe might have misread the Latin word exossus, meaning detestable, which would have been a common epithet to refer to a pagan tyrant in Christian chronicles, as exos, meaning boneless. The second explanation would be that the Old Norse word for bones can also refer to legs, so maybe the name would have been an ironic reference to him being exceptionally tall. So, as you can see, there are alternative explanations to him actually being boneless. If we look at contemporary Irish chronicles, we are going to see that they identify him as a son of the King of Lethland. He seems to have arrived in Ireland to join his kinsman, perhaps also brother, Olavur, but the location of this place, Lethland, is still disputed. Most evidence suggests that Lethland was located overseas. Some historians argue it described the Northern Isles of Scotland or the Hebrides, and from the 11th century, the name was also conflated with Lochlan, meaning Norway. There is also one theory that suggests that the name Lethland, meaning mud pool, was actually a derogatory term for Dublin, although the description of warriors arriving from overseas makes it less likely. An 11th century story found in the fragmentary annals of Ireland claims his father was a king of Lochlan, of Norway, named Gothred, son of Ragnar, and then we also have the Orkneyinga saga attempting to link him to the family of the Earls of Orkney, claiming he was a son of Rognvaldr of Möre, but this account is not considered credible. So, a lot of speculation, extensive speculation, but sadly, his true origin sort of remain in the shadows. What we do know is that he appears in insular records in the 850s when he arrives to Ireland and ends up dominating the Viking groups that had already settled there. So Ivar lands in Ireland alongside his associate and perhaps also brother Olavur, and maybe also someone called Orsel, according to the fragmentary annals. Upon their arrival, the Vikings had already settled in Ireland and they submitted to them, to this new group, and then Ivar's group successfully extracted tribute from the native Irish as well. A couple of years later, we find him organizing a campaign in Munster and defeating an army of Galgwidil. These would have been the Vikings of mixed heritage, Gaelic Scandinavian, led by someone called Ketil Finn. In 858, Ivar forms a strategic alliance with Kjarval Maduliu, the overking of Osrege, and together they defeat a large force of foreigner Gaels, so Hiberno Norse, at Aratire in the county of Tipperary. A year later, Ivar, Olavur, and Kjarval launch a major joint expedition into Meath, the heartland of the southern Uineal, and alongside Olavur, Orsel, and Lorcan, the king of Meath, Ivar plunders the lands of Brega, during which they also loot some ancient underground chambers, including the prehistoric site at Noth. In the 60s, Ivar shifts his focus to Britain, appearing as the primary leader of the Great Heathen Army that lands on the coast of East Anglia. The East Angles provide the army with horses for the subsequent inland campaigns, a sign that there were a lot of tensions between the English kingdoms too. Ivar leads the Great Army north into Northumbria, exploiting a local civil war to seize Jorvik, York in 866. And then in March 867, he defeats and kills the rival Northumbrian kings of Osberth and Ela when they attempt to retake the city. The army then moves into Mercia and establishes a winter base at Nottingham, and after a failed siege by the combined forces of both Mercian and West Saxon kings, the Mercians are forced to pay a truce. Ivar returns to East Anglia, where he defeats the East Anglian army in November, and then he is widely identified in contemporary and near contemporary records as the one responsible for the martyrdom of King Edmund and the total conquest of the kingdom. In 870, we find him in northern Britain, joining Olavur in a 4-month siege of Dumbarton Rock, the capital of the Strathclyde Britons. The fortress eventually surrenders after the defenders run out of water. Then they return to Dublin with a massive fleet, but also a great booty of people consisting of English, British, and Pictish captives to be sold as slaves in the Dublin markets. Then he dominates the Irish political landscape until his death in 873, reportedly from a hideous disease. What is very interesting is that upon his death, the Annals of Ulster awards him the prestigious and unprecedented title of King of Northmen of all Ireland and Britain. The late 10th century Chronicle of Ethelweard asserted that Ivar actually died in 869 or 70, shortly after the death of King Edmund. However, this disappearance from the English record may have simply been interpreted as a death, also because it followed the death of a very important saint king. So I think if we were to draw a conclusion about his many activities, his career serves as a very good example of how Viking leaders move from being simple sea raiders or family-based ventures to really becoming central players in the political structures of Britain and Ireland. His campaigns were aimed at subjugating entire kingdoms, such as Northumbria and East Anglia, and he also managed to establish the foundation for permanent Scandinavian settlement and successfully campaigned on both sides of the Irish Sea. His activities also integrated the British Isles into a vast long-distance trading network, especially if you look at settlements like Dublin that evolved from temporary camps into major international seaports with this sort of like hybrid Hiberno-Scandinavian culture that definitely facilitated trade between Scandinavia, continental Europe, and the insular world. His descendants even used royal insignia and coin minting, hence, they were aiming for more legitimate institutionalized sovereignty. A sort of expansionism also acted as a unifying force in the sense that the existential threat posed by the Great Army prompted the descendants of Alfred the Great in England and the dynasty of Kinnaird in Scotland to pursue political unification as a means of defense in the face of the Northmen. On the other hand, in Ireland, his presence destabilized historically dominant groups like the Uí eventually allowing more marginalized groups such as the Dál Gosh to rise. In the Irish Chronicles, he is remembered as the ancestor of the Uí the dynasty that would rule the major seaports of Ireland such as Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick until as late as the 12th century. These Northmen, whose activities are recorded in sources like the Annals of Innisfallen or Clonmacnoise, would merge then with Irish lineages through marriage and fosterage. Gormleth, for example, the daughter of the King of Leinster, was married in succession to Olavur or Amleb Quarran, Malsagnel II, the Overking of the southern Uí and also Brian Boroma. Her son, Sigtrygr Silkenbeard, who ruled Dublin for almost 50 years, is a very good example of this mix. He is the son of a Viking king and an Irish princess, a part of this new Hiberno-Norse elite. Now, this chronology is based on the fact that Ivar and Ymer are one and the same person. So, were they really? Well, this is one of those questions where we don't really have an absolute certainty. But yeah, I think most likely this is the case because the careers of Ivar in England and Ymer in Ireland, they overlap perfectly in the mid 9th century. And there is also the argument of Ymer's absence from the English chronicles between 864 and 861, which would correspond directly with the period Ivar the Boneless was leading the great heathen army in the conquest of York and East Anglia. And now for the second part. Where was he buried? Well, the piece that was published pretty much everywhere in the British media and beyond is safe to say that it's not really accurate, yeah, to say the least. We're actually dealing with sensationalism here that was put forward with extremely flimsy, if non existent, evidence. There isn't really any indication in the documents that he actually had a base in Cumbria, let alone a palace, as it was described. And later medieval sources for burial mounds, they're really not reliable in the sense that they're rather trying to make sense of the past by linking elements in the landscape to all kinds of ancient kings that are more a matter of tradition and folklore. This is more of a 19th century obsession with finding the graves of very well defined people from records or sagas. I mean, even if the mound is excavated, we wouldn't know for sure that it is Ivar we're dealing with. So we have name dropping for nationalistic romanticist purposes in the past, like when they were obsessed with Queen Orsa in the Oseberry burial. But now we have name dropping for, I don't know, attention or funding. We don't even know if there is a grave there. Many of these mounds are cenotaphs. Some of them were actually built way before the Viking-age, in the migration period, or even the Bronze Age. And there are also new interpretations now in archaeology that some would have been built by collective effort as a means of dealing with a crisis, for example, or appeasing the gods. So, not necessarily this top down approach that they were commissioned by a king. So, anyway, there is no convincing evidence for this, and neither is there for the ship burial. We do have indeed ship rivets that were found via metal detecting in the area, but we definitely need more research to actually contextualize all of this. On the other hand, if no bones are found in the grave, then maybe this is indeed Ivar the Boneless grave after all. Anyway, the truth is, we don't know where the burial is. And sometimes that is enough said. You have to be comfortable with the limitations of your knowledge. There are, however, some conflicting theories. One of the most prominent theories associated Ivar with a Viking winter camp in Repton, which the Great Heathen Army occupied in 873-74. And in this context, we have an 18th century account describing the discovery of a mound in a vicarage garden containing the stone coffin with a skeleton allegedly 9 feet long. So that would be almost 3 meters, I think. And it is also described that he would have been surrounded by 100 other human skeletons. So some researchers have speculated that this giant figure was Ivar the Boneless, but the skeleton disappeared. And there isn't any contemporary evidence in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle placing Ivar at Repton during that winter either. So there's that. Also, people enjoy making things up, especially in the 18th and 19th century. And then we have the osteological analysis of the remaining bones at Repton, which did not provide conclusive evidence of his presence either. Then we have the late Icelandic sources offering a different account of his death and burial. The 30th century Ragnar Saga Loðbrókar and the tale of Ragnar's sons state that Ivar died of old age in England. And the stories insist that he was buried in England in a burial mound. And the legends also suggest that this burial was intended to serve as a supernatural protection for the land against future invaders, which is somewhat of a trope in these stories where the landscape often seems to be imbued with a certain life force. These same accounts credit him with avenging his father by subjecting King Ella of Northumbria to the infamous Blood Eagle, that gruesome execution that is likely a 13th century literary misunderstanding of older skaldic poetry, which tends to use quite a lot the metaphor of birds of prey feasting on dead bodies. So, yeah, a lot of mythologized embellishments on the part of later medieval authors. However, Ivar might have indeed died in Ireland rather than England, and this theory rests on the identification I spoke of earlier between Ivar the Boneless and Ymer, the founder of the Uimer dynasty in Dublin. So, this is what the Annals of Ulster's record, that he died in 873, and also some other annals as well. And if they are indeed the same person, in all likelihood, he died in Ireland, but the annals don't really specify the exact burial site. Then there's also a semi legendary account in the Ynglinga saga mentioning a King Ingvar, which is a name sometimes confused with Ivar in later traditions, who was killed during a raid in Estonia and buried in a mound by the sea on the island of Saaremaa. However, this figure is generally dated the 7th century, making him totally distinct from the Ivar associated with the Great Heathen Army. However, if you want to find out about the Salme burials in Estonia, there is a brilliant episode of the podcast Mound and Memory on the channel with my colleague Howard from Chester, so make sure you check that out. So that was it about Eva for now. I really do hope you enjoyed this overview, and if you find my work in public history useful, please do consider a paid membership to help fund more work, keep the channel going, and also my academic research too, because institutional support is quite limited in my case. Anyway, thanks a lot. Thank you for watching or listening. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.